listeners. This is our recap episode for Season 2, Solarpunk. I'm Caroline, and this has been very interesting. This has been exactly what I wanted it to be. I feel like I got a real insight into all the different ways, even within this narrow category, that one might organize a society. That was what I wanted. It was exciting. What about you?
I'm Carly, and this season made me understand a bit more about the history of social movements that have actually had an impact on my personal life. Like, I really had to get uncomfortable with some of these books to push against my assumptions and preconceived notions and really try to be open to ideas about how societies could be organized and like what human nature means. So, very satisfying group of books we had.
Good. I guess we should list the books just in case someone, isn't familiar, right?
Sure.
Ecotopia by Ernest Callenbach, A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk, and then Suncatcher
by Alia Guy.
The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin, Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson, Earth Abides by George Stewart, and Walk Away by Cory Doctorow. And that was the order we read them in, too.
Yep. Let's talk about the concepts of solarpunk and, the genre themes we talked about throughout. But we started with specific genre themes, right? Like, what were the genre themes you expected going into it?
Well, I expected creative and optimistic use of technology. I expected that societies would be organized along different principles. I expected those societies to be liberal and progressive, which I think we saw, particularly with the number and types of relationships and identities in every book. What else did I expect? I expected that there would have to be some sort of different relationship to meaning in life, and also how one finds that meaning, and what the basis of someone's self-esteem should be. I think our current culture, it's very much based on consumption, and humans are status-oriented animals. I wouldn't expect that to go away, but I think having status be oriented around things and buying and having the right sort of things, that does seem like something that would need to change. And we did see that was very different in all of those societies. What else? What were you expecting?
Well, I was expecting utopias, and many of the books were utopia. Some of them were not. But I like that optimistic view of using technology, like technology as a net benefit to mankind. I'm used to dystopian stories, and I've read plenty of science fiction that was supposed to be taken as a warning about the influence of technology on human society. I was really looking forward and really enjoyed the stories about technology as a positive influence on society.
Another aspect of that I feel like I didn't quite say initially is that while technology was important, I feel like that was balanced by one's relationship to Earth and nature. I personally am generally unmoved by stories about what technology is going to do for us and how it's going to advance. Like, that just by itself doesn't do much for me. But here it was so grounded in a very specific sort of connection to the earth that made it appealing to me.
Well, I've been to a lot of lectures sort of related to economics or like politics that have talked about like, no, technology is a benefit. And, examples I'm used to hearing are how dishwashers and washing machines relieved so much labor, especially for women. And so I'm used to hearing about that in a very different context. I'm not used to thinking about that in stories, especially science fiction. Like, in the science fiction I'm used to is it's either dystopian or the technology is just sort of background and it's cool and interesting. But thinking about the real societal impact of the way certain technology advances would have on our culture, and like really thinking about we need to have clear intent, there's a lot of talk now about AI, and there's a lot of fear around what AI will do. And so I like being proactive and thinking about the trade-offs that AI can give us and making sure that our society evolves in a way so that technology does benefit. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about walk away here, that it does benefit everyone, not further create distance between the haves and the have-nots.
Yes. Along those same lines, what I enjoyed the most was how open these books were about, hey, we have to reorder our priorities. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not just on a social level about, what gets funded, but internally, emotionally, personally, we have to decide that our status or, this particular type of creature comfort are not worth more than making sure that everyone in the society has what they need at a baseline to flourish. And that to me is part of the nitty-gritty of these conversations, right? It's one thing to debate policy or economics at large, but the real question to me always has been, well, what am I willing to give up? Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's name those things now. And I think that's actually been one of the best parts of this book. It's helped me name those things. And some of them, I name them and I think, yeah, that's true. I can give that up, or I should work on that. Or I think, ooh, am I
Yeah.
going to do that? Right. And that's been some of the benefit here.
Right. Yeah.
I feel like I should probably provide examples to go with that statement. So I think it's one thing for me, the idea of giving up status based on consumption seems justifiable and straightforward, easy almost in a way. Giving up something like my privacy, maybe to have either denser living or communal living that would build a greater sense of community. I can see the argument for it. That's a harder one for me personally to want to give up. Were there any similar examples for you? I know you agreed with me on the privacy one.
Yeah. Well, I think the other than that, the other most uncomfortable thoughts coming up in these books are like the idea of getting rid of money, because I don't think that money is inherently evil, but I think a lot of the philosophies presented in a few of these books would take that stance.
Yeah.
Clearly, again, in Walk Away, she's very explicit about it, but I think in a few of these books, money is not important. And having a gift economy is a huge intellectual leap for me. Like, I just don't have a lot of faith that would work.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see it in practice. But yeah, reading these books has made me think more carefully about, like, I'm not going to reject that idea. I'm going to think about it more clearly about, like, if we really wanted a gift economy, first of all, I'm not sure that's what I want. But if I was in a community of people who I valued who wanted a gift economy, I would be more open to thinking about how to get there, and make sure things are run smoothly and justly, I guess.
Another one that I sort of struggled with, I could see the argument for in some ways, but in some ways it was too close to the bone, was also in Walk Away, the idea of giving up your conception of yourself as special. He called it snowflake status, which was kind of an annoying phrase. But I can see the argument there, right? And it very easily translates to a lot of the other arguments that I just made, such as, well, why should I get to have, a third car when some people don't have housing, or, et cetera, whatever example you want, right? That argument itself is, aren't we all equal in some fundamental way? But then also, yes, I do think I'm special, right? Like, we all do. Not in that way. I don't need three cars, but in other
Sure.
ways, yes.
No, but like in some of the earlier books, like I'm thinking of A Fifth Sacred Thing. Like The Fifth Sacred Thing, there was a lot of real deep primal love for your family, for the fruits of your labor, for community. And you're talking about special snowflake lists. I think the snowflake commentary in Walkway is about, do you have the right to decide things for people, or for things that have impact on greater society? Like the clearest example is, like, if you make a lot of money and then you donate to charity, like, why do you have the right to decide which charities get resources? And that's really hard Because we're so
Right.
used to thinking about like you earn the money, you earned it through your labor, and therefore you get to decide what happens with it. And Walk Away broke with that concept. I don't think the other books went that far. Like there was a real love of labor for labor's sake in some of the other books, but it was still like yours, you know?
Well, kind of. The Dispossessed, they talked a lot about labor, and you're supposed to do what you're good at and be free to pursue what labor you want to do. But as a matter of fact, they were often kind of shuffled around as society needed, and they'd be sent out and work, at this paper factory for 6 months and then go somewhere else. That there's kind of an alienation from labor there. They weren't choosing and they weren't getting to enjoy the fruits. And there was certainly a lot of shame about you thinking you were entitled to more. There was even that example where the main character hadn't eaten for 2 days, so he ate extra in the communal kitchen. And he hadn't eaten for 2 days because he was working for the society, and he ate extra in the communal kitchen, and he felt like he was shamed for that. So some of them had, in addition to Walk Away, had a separation between your labor and you should enjoy it and you should get the fruits of it, whatever that means.
Right. Also in The Dispossessed, Shevik writes this brilliant physics paper and gets upset. He doesn't get credit for authorship. Like his mentor is also listed as an author and his mentor didn't do anything for that paper.
Right.
So it's like that kind of credit. I don't, it's not exactly status, but it's like a sort of possessiveness over reaping the rewards of your labor. And I don't know what I think about that. Like I kind of sympathize with the idea of like, just because you make a lot of money doesn't mean that you have some divine purpose to distribute that money, right? Like I don't think people who make a lot of money in our current society, yes, their talents are valued in some way, and that's sort of how the economics fall, but I don't think there's any sort of like divine like bestowal of gifts necessarily because of the size of your paycheck. So I'm there, but I'm not as far as like The Dispossessed. I don't quite connect with.
Right. I think we're in agreement that money, just because someone can earn money doesn't mean they really either deserve the money or they deserve to have the power that it can bring, like with donating to charity. But I think there are more in between examples, like someone who has a skill, like let's say medicine, that they've spent a lot of time developing, but is also for the good of the community and is very necessary and needed. It somewhat makes sense the community would have a say in where that skill is used, right? Like if it's needed here versus there. But also that may start to conflict with some of the walkaway philosophies, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the question is, how does a society communicate where that medical need is, where that medical provider should go to have the most impact? But what if that medical provider, like we talked about this in The Dispossessed too, like Shevik's partner, whose name I can't remember, but it was very harsh, lots of consonants in that word. Oh,
Yes.
Takfur. Her name was Takfur.
Oh,
So
gosh.
when she had the skill to cultivate algae, which could, solve problems for their huge famine that they went through, but she was also breastfeeding a child. And so dividing her labor between breastfeeding her child or like cultivating algae, there was a conflict there. And so it's like, maybe this gets into one of our genre themes of what makes a good society. Like in a good society, what is the outcome we want when there's that kind of conflict? And which of the books gave us the best examples of how to resolve that kind of conflict, how to put the people with the skills in the place where their skills can be used?
Well, The Dispossessed addressed that very directly in the way we discussed. The Fifth Sacred Thing didn't address that. It just seemed that it trusted people would want to go where they were needed and would figure it out. Walk Away would hate the idea of anyone being told where to go, or even maybe being expected to go somewhere. I think in Ecotopia, they had sort of management bodies who would figure out where someone was needed, and they would tell people, and those people would accept it, and they would go. I don't know that the others addressed it, right?
Sure. In Ecotopia, it seemed like there was a lot of freedom to like switch careers if you wanted to. I don't know that we got examples of that, but I don't remember any particular explanation to say that would be frowned upon. Like you could.
That's true.
you could work or not and switch work as you wished.
Well, there were no limitations preventing you from switching jobs in the dispossessed either, other than social disapproval, which it turns out is quite coercive.
Right, right. So, that gets to one of my answers. What makes a good society is minimal coercion. That's in my opinion.
Yeah, I know I just said that the dispossessed showed us that social pressure is also a form of coercion, and I'm not pro coercion, but I don't know that that by itself is the litmus test for me. I think it's something more like, can people lead rich lives? In my opinion, to lead a rich life, you have to have some degree of freedom and variety and ability to change what you're doing and such. So maybe it comes out the same, but I don't know that coercion itself is the number one test for me. I think it's something much vaguer, like human flourishing.
Well, I find that interesting because in my mind, if a person is being coerced, then they cannot find for themselves what will help them flourish the most, right? Like I do recognize in Ecotopia, this was clear. Our narrator, like he couldn't see the decision before him to stay in Ecotopia until his friends kidnapped him and made him hang out in a spa until he had the self-realization. And then he understood, oh, if I will flourish if I'm in Ecotopia, and then he could make the decision to stay. So that doesn't feel like coercion to me. Like they did kidnap him, but it was in a context of caring for him and making sure that he made the decision for himself. So that didn't feel like coercion. I can't separate that from human flourishing. Like human flourishing for me must have the freedom to choose your own path. And because only you can understand how you will flourish.
No disagreement with that. I just think there's more levels of coercion and more levels of productive limitation where the difference is hard to see. So currently in the US, we require that children learn to read, right? That they go to school and they get a certain minimum amount of schooling. I think there's a very strong argument that opens the path for greater freedom going forward, but it's coercive. I also think absent things like the gulag and executions for little to no reason, I think there are a lot of internal forms of coercion that people either do to themselves or participate in because we're social people. We're born into certain families. We want to have high standards for ourselves. We guilt ourselves, etc. So to me, there just ends up being a plethora of overlapping limitations, some of which are good, some of which are bad, some of which are time limited, some not.
Yeah, but those limitations, some of the ones that you listed were not an effect of a societal wide structure. They weren't like institutionalized. Like I understand, being part of a family, being part of a community, you feel pressures in a certain way. But and we saw that in A Fifth Sacred Thing. We saw that in Suncatcher, the interpersonal relationships. But it's different when it's like in The Dispossessed, where it's a societal institution.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about what makes a good society.
I agree that choice and freedom are an important component of that. I just don't think that's not my touchstone. That's not the definition to me that's most useful, but I'm being very vague in what I think the goal is. Sure. So it's fair to be annoyed by that.
Yeah. Well, do you want to talk about societal change? We saw different time frames. We saw at the beginning of a new society in a couple of books. We saw 100, 200 years later. We saw thousands of years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Fifth Sacred Thing talked about overcoming 5,000 years and that it might take 5,000 years to do that.
To make an effective change, basically.
Yes. Yeah. Walk away. I would argue that walk away actually took place right before the societal change because there's so many references in that book to early days of a better nation that I don't think the good society has arrived yet.
Yeah. But they're making the effort to make it change. Like
yes,
that was their intention.
Right. And then Seven Eves obviously had a 5 or a 10,000 year time leap, right?
Yeah.
5,000. Yeah. So I think there were a lot of questions bound up in that. Like, how long does change take? We saw some of those examples. But then also, how does that actually happen? What is the inciting event? Or does it require an inciting event?
Yeah, it's interesting. In Walkway, the inciting event is a movement of people pushing for change.
True.
Although, yeah, so that's really different from the other books, I think.
Yeah, I think generally one of my casual definitions of Solarpunk is that they are responding to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
That generally is the inciting event, as it was for Ecotopia, Fifth Sacred Thing, a couple of others maybe, although there were kind of vaguer references to what it was in those.
Emergency Skin.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to talk about societal change, when does societal change happen? In these stories, we have individual characters responding and making changes. Like, you can't have one without the other.
Right. Well, true. But one thing I noticed in these books where there was a big event like a climate change or a climate catastrophe is that sort of like an alien invasion. It brought people together because it was an external threat. But then, unlike an alien invasion, I think it's implied in several of these books that people had to ask what they were doing wrong. It holds a mirror up to society in ways that other catastrophes and changes don't.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, if your inciting event is climate change, it can be uniquely powerful.
Even with Seven Eves, where it's kind of climate change, but it's not man-made climate change that caused the catastrophe. But even there, you had people disagreeing on how to respond to it. I find that part fascinating, the conflicts.
Yes. I think that was the only book that really talked about those conflicts. In the other books, people sort of sorted themselves into the society that agreed with the right response and they stayed there.
In Fifth Sacred Thing, there were people who responded differently that they went to
they were
war
down in the
with.
South, right?
Right. So it's like they were still contending with people who wanted to make different decisions. I mean, even in Earth Abides, they had to think about people who responded differently. And they actually, I wonder if you could say, even in Earth Abides, that within the tribe, people disagreed and still were able to live together in peace, essentially.
Yeah. One of the other takeaways for this book, we'll talk about this later, but for this season, for me, is thinking a lot about how people resolve disputes in a nonviolent and non-litigious way. But that's one of them, right? How do you work it out as a society? What you agree the next goal is, or what is a sufficient level of agreement, even if not everyone's on board? Those are important questions.
We talked a lot about trade-offs. I think that's always part of it. It's like, can I trade being right about this situation if it means that we move together as a group? Or in Seven Eves, there wasn't a lot of room for disagreement, and the disagreements ended up that they only had 8 living people at one point. And so at that point, they had to work together.
Right.
But in the other books, people were free to walk away. And the Dispossessed, not so much. The character who had strong differing opinions ended up in an insane asylum.
Yeah. So what do you do when you can't walk away? No one can walk away. We are sort of forced to figure this out together to the extent we can, right? A decent metaphor for climate change. I'm sure.
Sure. Well, it's wow. It's really stressing me out to think about, actually. I think about in Seven Eves, the N of one, that we only have one Earth. We can't test and experiment 1,000 times and see which inputs produce the best output. It's like we have to have faith. That was a big thing that came out of this season that I wasn't thinking about, because I have been faithless, I guess, for a while. I was like, it's all science. I don't believe in things. But the idea of, I didn't have any concept of what faith meant. I was really struggling with that. But the idea of faith, that we have one Earth, we have one life, one chance to do the right thing as far as making sure that there is a future for our future generations. You have to have faith that you're making the right decision.
You have to have faith that there will be a future. Right?
Yeah.
Yours and others, I guess.
Your actions are going to bring about the best possible future, if you can.
If you act, right?
Yeah.
Or refrain. You just stated it in the most universal way possible. But that was another ongoing concept or theme, right? Is recognition of humans as natural, some would even say animal creatures, and then also strong connection with natural laws and cycles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that balance between feeling like a part, one small part in a very large ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
and then also feeling like you have the choice to step outside of that with machines, with technology, insulating yourself from the effects of nature.
Right, which has a limit, which maybe we are meeting.
Right.
It's interesting for such a hopeful genre. It's about limitations too, in large part. The limitations of society, of technology, of humans. I mean, we still die and grieve and suffer and have physical bodies that go through all those changes. We're still very susceptible to things like the weather, the breeze.
Mm-hmm. The sun.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to get into takeaways?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the first question that we got to answer is, which book did you enjoy reading the most?
For me, it's Psalm for the Wild Built. That was just the most pure. It says right on the cover of the book that it's just like a delightful enjoyment.
It is.
And it was. Yeah.
For me, it's Fifth Sacred Thing. Just such a beautiful spiritual bath in good ideas and good people. And I could just read that over and over.
I loved The Fifth Sacred Thing for sure, but I mean, I did a lot of crying while I was reading that book too. Like,
yeah,
that's
true. There's some
intense.
hard stuff. A Song for the Wild Bill. I will also reread that one because it was just charming.
Right.
Like, I just felt good.
Yeah.
The whole time.
Yeah.
No crying.
So did your opinion of any of the books change between reading the book and then our discussion of the book?
I think there were two that were like that, Suncatcher and Seven Eves, and for similar reasons. I didn't particularly enjoy reading them because the world building was either kind of overstuffed or overdescribed.
Mm-hmm.
But then our conversations were able to pull out the threads that were meaningful. And particularly with Suncatcher, I saw that there were layers and connections between this very Baroque and in-depth world building. What about you?
Yeah, I think I agree. Suncatcher, I enjoyed our conversation about Suncatcher. There were a lot of good ideas that came out of it, but the act of reading it was a little bit of a chore sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Is that the book you'll never read again?
Yes. Probably. Although now, like, I feel like it would make a really good TV script, like, or movie script.
There was so much there.
Maybe I should try writing a screenplay
based on that book.
Yeah. Although I bet the rights already belong to someone. I don't know. It'd be an interesting exercise.
I would read later books by that author because that was her first book. And as far as I know, only yet. But I would read future ones. I would maybe have some faith that the things I disliked in that style would sort of get cleaned up over time. For me, the book I will never read again is Seven Eves. And I will also, to be honest, never read any Neil Stephenson either.
Oh my goodness. You're breaking my heart.
I know, because you've told me there's so many ideas in his books. I've heard, about some of them from you for other of his books. I just cannot stand that over descriptive style about the technology and the setting, not even about people.
What if one of his books was made into a movie or TV show? Would you watch it?
Oh, probably, because ideally it would have the ideas, but not the prose, and perhaps the actors could make the characters more lifelike. So yeah,
Sure.
That might solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. We tried to do classic, bestseller, indie. I don't think we had a young adult book this season.
I think Psalm for the Wild Built or Suncatcher would qualify.
Okay. Did you notice any different emphasis based on like what the market was for the book?
I wouldn't say that. I definitely noticed that the older books that would be Ecotopia and Earth Abides were definitely, from a white male viewpoint and fairly limited in that regard. And then as they got more recent, they seemed to incorporate more viewpoints and identities, even though, they were all written by one author. So I noticed that. And then the thing I just said about Suncatcher, which is that was, I think, our indie book. And it was also her first book. And I would watch that career as it develops. Whereas, a lot of the older authors, that's not true because they're not recently published first authors.
Are there any authors that you want to read more of?
I mean, Starhawk, I love her work. That book is actually a trilogy, so I've read that. and I will happily reread that again. And then she has also a lot of nonfiction on all types of things. She's a practicing witch, so there's a good bit on that and on rituals. But there's also actually a good bit on community building, how to resolve disputes without having an appointed leader, how to build meaningful things like rituals together with other people and not just dictating it. So all of that is amazing.
Cool. Yeah, I think definitely Starhawk. I'd love to read more Becky Chambers.
Same. Yeah. She's prolific.
Did you want to talk more about societal change?
Yeah. So there was, and this just kind of goes with general review thoughts, I guess. We've talked a lot about societal change, what needs to change, how people and individuals and institutions need to change. There's so much that needs to be left behind, et cetera. Like we've talked about this for 9 episodes. I think now we said that rather lightly. Given the context it was in, that made sense. But it's really quite risky in some ways to say that there are whole pieces of a society that need to be changed and gotten rid of. And what brought this up was that I recently have started doing more reading about cultural revolutions, like in the Soviet Union and in China. And those are examples, and the French Revolution, of times in history where people decided, hey, we need a clean break with the past. We need the new society to be fundamentally different in many ways or in every way. That led to a lot of violence and instability because they felt that they had to, in order to reach that shining new future, they had to cut down so many of the things that were giving strength in the current, like the family or existing social structures. There ended up being too much policing of each other and punishment for bad thoughts and stuff like that. So that made me think back to how often we've said things like, wow, this needs to change, or people need to think differently. And so now I'm thinking about how do you make a big change, but in a more sustainable and safe way, meaning that people change, right? It's not forced on them at all. And I don't have the answer to that. Other than that, some of the answer is things like books like these and discussions of books like these that make people think and about what they want, the society they want. But, people have to choose it. You can only get the word out there and hope that they do, right?
Do you think that making personal changes and like just living your life according to your values can have an impact? Like, is it even worth it to just start with that?
Yeah, of course. I'm not one of these people who thinks that, well, most pollution is caused by giant companies, so don't do anything. It's not necessarily the degree of impact on a discrete thing. It's the fact that you're choosing something better and other people see that also. But I think it's not just enough to do those things like recycling or promoting a better relationship with labor, or name any of the things that you can name. I think you also have to talk about it and get other people to talk about it and share and create art that does those same things. The example is good. More than that is also required, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes sense. Really wanting to just like dive back into Psalm for the Wild Belt and just like make tea and grow herbs and not have to think about other people making their decisions.
Yes. Okay, so if someone is only going to read one of these 9 books, which one would you recommend?
Ooh, so the idea is to convey the Solarpunk spirit. I would say Fifth Sacred Thing.
Yeah.
It had the biggest impact on me, I think.
I think that conveys the emotions and the experience of what it would be like to live in that one of those societies the best. Oddly, though, that's not my answer as much as I love that book. For me, I think it's Ecotopia because it's short, but it carries an overview of everything that would get you thinking about how society could be differently organized and what it would look like to have, the forestry sector organized differently. Or, well, what if the schools weren't based on such competition heavy lines? Then children would grow up differently. I think Ecotopia is sort of the best little primer.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And what was the best discussion?
I think it was Emergency Skin, and that might be kind of cheating because it was like a short story. So we kind of launched off into our own conversation afterward. But I remember having a very good conversation about really what would we give up and what do we feel guilt about what we're not giving up. So since I remember it, I figure it was impactful and therefore the best. What about you?
I loved our discussion on Seven Eves. I mean, it was pure self-indulgence for me because I love that book and I loved having a guest.
That was also a very good discussion.
I remember talking about identity in and what qualities of humanity should be preserved for the future, and that has really stuck with me.
I do like that. Okay, so going forward, what sort of topics, like nonfiction topics, are you interested in?
Well, I already said I really want to spend some time reading about people who are making tea and growing herbs and not doing anything much more difficult than that.
That sounds great.
I want to break from the deep thoughts for a little bit.
Yeah, fair. So I think for me, I already mentioned one. I'm very interested now in the history of social movements and the history of revolutions, both the ones that did not work, the ones that worked too well and didn't last, and the ones that worked and lasted. I think it also, all of this reading really lit a fire in me about mediation and dispute resolution. Because in every one of these books, there's generally no authority figure who walks in and breaks up fights or helps people resolve a dispute. Someone just has these skills and steps forward and does it. And that is like the good economy version of my job.
Yeah.
And so I'm just fascinated by that. I want to do a lot more reading on what those skills are, how you develop them, how do they exist in a vacuum of authority, right? Which I assume means you have to get people to buy into it, all sorts of things, right? Those things are my current interests going forward.
Cool. And what books do you want to read more of? What kind of books do you want to read more of after this?
I want to reread some of these books, like Fifth Sacred Thing, Psalm for the Wild Bill. And I want to read even more fiction like this. Like I haven't identified the books yet, but these sort of hopeful descriptions of other societies is what I really need right now. What about you?
A lot of these books have sequels, and so I want to read some of the sequels. I don't know if I'll read all of Ursula K. Le Guin, but I am kind of intrigued by the world that she has built. Because she has many other books about with this whole history of like the origin of humankind not being from Earth and these alien planets and how they work together. So I'm curious about that. And then the Becky Chambers. Yeah.
I'll read her works. It's like the three, well, not the only three women authors, but three of them have a lot of other books I want to read. Ursula K. Le Guin, Becky Chambers, and Starhawk.
Well, and also I do want to read, I think it's a prequel to Ecotopia. I'm curious about that.
Oh, I didn't know there was a prequel.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So this concludes our recap episode and season 2 on Solarpunk. We are going to take a break before season 3, but we will continue posting in our Substack newsletter. You can subscribe to that at bookclubpod.com. If you are new to Substack, you should know that it's a great app, but you don't have to download the app to read our newsletter. All you need is an email address. And if you want to support the podcast, you can sign up for a paid subscription. And we are very grateful for our paid subscribers. So thanks to all of you who are paying for our Substack subscription. You're helping to support the podcast.
The Book Club podcast is produced by Carly Jackson and Caroline Gorman. Music and audio editing by Alex Marcus. Thanks for listening.